Thanks, Sarah. I think what you said about the connection between making these film poems and experience, where you can go to the lived place, there's a live experience, and then also the way in which you shape and form to distract that really does things that you can't do in a poem on the page. And that for me is what's most fascinating about this, about how the genre's blossomed in recent years.
Right.
So I'm going to suggest, if it's all right with all of you, that I read from the couch rather than stand up there, since it's such an intimate group.
Very egalitarian.
So I recently had a small collection of poems about San Francisco called Lyon Street, published by Bamboo Dart Press, which is a Southern California publisher. I think Raymond's got a copy there. And you can find them at the back of the room. The story behind these poems is that I came of age in San Francisco in a very, very different time. It was before the conservative revolution, it was before Reagan, it was before AIDS. I was telling some of these folks before this started that my upstairs neighbor bought the first Apple II computer ever sold in the city. And the city changed quite radically in the years since. And so from time to time I write poems about the city as it was, how it was changing, and then in recent years reflecting back on that period. And at a certain point, a dear friend of mine, who's a screenwriter named Erin Cressida Wilson, got in touch with me, and she said, Mark, it's really time for you to gather your San Francisco poems. And over a period of a few years, I trimmed them down to a very slim volume, and they were recently published. The collection for me is meant to do two things. One is to open up the city to those who were there then, and those who want to know more about what it was like and how it came to be. And secondly, the city that we knew then was a libertine place. It was a rough-edged place. It was kind of dangerous. It was a whole lot of fun, but it was much more democratic. People mixed with each other. They were kind to each other. They were gentle. I was part of the punk scene back then, and the difference between San Francisco punk at the beginning and the way things evolved as the punk scene became hardcore was when you were slam dancing at the Mabuhay Gardens, if you got knocked down, someone would pick you up. And that ain't true anymore. So I wrote this collection to do that. When I was coming of age in the city, my interests really were not in poetry. They were in sound, in music, and in film. And I used to work at a recording studio in the Mission called Different Fur, which is on 19th Street. And it's still there today. I remember very clearly the first session I ever worked there. It was on some singles with a band called Crime. And living members of that band are still around San Francisco, still doing their thing. It's down to one.
That's right.
Yeah, Hank and Ron.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hank Rank, yeah.
Yeah, and Joey DK's still around too. He produced their stuff. And it was in the context of film and sound that I began to develop an ear for poetry. I was working at Different Fur as an apprentice to Pat Gleason, who is a master synthesist, a composer. He had been an English professor at San Francisco State before changing up his life and going on the road with Herbie Hancock. And at one point, Pat was making the soundtrack for a film on San Francisco poets for KQED-TV. KQED is the public television station here. And I got to work with him on that and hear poem after poem after poem traveling over what up until we made the soundtrack was a silent film track. And I began to get a sense of the music and rhythm of poetry in a way that I never could on the page. Some months later, after I had worked an all-night session with some obscure band and was getting up from the couch where I'd got a couple of hours of sleep, Pat came downstairs and said, Mark, I've got a contract to work on a film. Would you like to apprentice with me on it for the next few months? And I just said, sure, what's the film? And he said, Apocalypse Now. And so I spent months and months and months working on that film and the synthesis with Pat and hearing endless hours of Martin Sheen's voiceovers to the movie. And if you ever want to know how to get into the depth of the words, work on a tiny fragment of scene and hear that same voice going for 17 hours straight.
Well, plus, Mark, I mean, as I talk about poetry and Apocalypse Now,
Yeah.
the outtakes, there's a beautiful outtake of Marlon Brando doing the full version of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which
Oh,
is
yeah.
incredible.
Yeah.
And that really is the essence of that film, too, in many ways.
Yeah, Heart of Darkness and The Wasteland.
And The Wasteland, Heart of Darkness, exactly.
Yeah, so in recent years, those interests came together, and I've worked with, I don't know, roughly 10, 12 directors on films from my poems. So tonight I'm going to read you a few poems from Lyon Street, and then we're going to show some films. You'll notice they're very different from Sarah's, and as she said, one of the wonderful things about poetry film as a genre, or set of related genres, I think more accurately, is that it is open to all sorts of interpretation, and yet it has to exist in some sense, either as a poetry film in which the poetry is brought to life in the film, or a film poem where the film itself is the poem. And so I think you'll see a little bit of that. So let me begin with a few poems. And I do apologize, I've got a familial tremor, so my hand shakes a little bit. It makes it a little hard to turn the pages. This one is called Less Than Burlesque, and it is set in North Beach, circa 1979, 1980, something like that. In high school, we'd go down to the Condor, where Carol Doda's electric nipples flashed high above the corner at Broadway in Columbus, crossroads of Old North Beach. I saw her once descend from the ceiling atop a chipped white baby grand piano and spin her tassels, crazy propellers in opposite directions, while B-girls pumped sailors and conventioneers for drinks. We knew those girls and would lounge, arms across their bare shoulders, drinking Cuba Libras, until clusters of corpulent marks would stumble into the joint, and the girls would slip away, teetering on lucite. We counted ourselves lucky bumming drinks from strippers in cum-stained San Francisco, drag queens strutting above Enrico's, tranny whores dishing dirt at Clown Alley. And all this seemed innocent in the year before Reagan and the coming of AIDS. Carnival life on the Barbary shore, a perfect faith that this was forever. As we ambled across Broadway down Columbus, turned into specks, the Adler Museum Monocularium, drank Anchor steam, climbed the secret stairs to Apple and Eve, saw the dancing girl with welts on her thighs, and realized all this was not just play. This one's called Mile High. It's set in Oakland. At that time, there was a blues club called Eli's Mile High Club, which was the best blues club anywhere in the Bay Area. Just fantastic place. It later shut down, then moved to another place, became sort of a hardcore punk club, and it's turned in the last year or so in its new location back to blues. But this was when it was at its height. The last time I went to Eli's Mile High Club at 25th on the Milky Way in Oakland, California, the question topmost in my mind was, would I be fed or would I be food? The pork-loined white pit bull who guarded the dark side of the house lot next to Eli's tensed against his leather tether, teeth catching moonlight and reflecting it, intensified, past my specs, lens, pupil, pulsing iris, onto my retina, which told my optic nerve to reform my amygdala via dense, blood-gorged brain tissue, organ meat. That measured flight was not a bad option on any particular day, but this was not. I'd walk past the small bar, having handed my bills to a doorman coon bouncer, half again as wide as the entry he was guarding, and perhaps chance to see Eli's ghost, who liked to hang around sometimes on a Friday night. Just because he got shot there didn't mean he lost affection for the place. From a gustatory perspective, the murder was a loss. The Liquor Control Board, in its linear fashion, decided that hard liquor and execution did not mix, at least when it came to the proprietor's heirs. Oakland's finest blues club was beer and wine only, and the wine should have come in a can. The question upmost in my mind as I plumped myself at a table just off the dance floor stage left, was hot links or barbecue grilled on a split oil drum out back. I was there to see Lowell Fulson, who still wore a suit no matter where he played, to meet my friends and to dance 8 beats to the bar. But now I was hungry. After deliberating intently on the pros and cons of picking beef shreds out of my teeth all night versus eating ground whatever stuffed into an intestinal sack, origins covered in cayenne and dried chilies, I opted for the links. They came to my table with collards and rice, swimming in sauce, which I mopped up with a soggy single slice of Wonder Bread. I asked the waitress for another slice, that is. She looked at me and said, "Are you fucking crazy?" I smiled at her and she brought one, then another and another and another, eye flirting, till the plate was clean, save for half a slice of white. She returned, draft in one hand, slice in the other, put down the beer, looked at my plate, the bread in her hand, and laughed, big, deep, and open. "Think I need some more sauce," said I, rising from the table, putting my hand to her waist. We weren't eye flirting now. I took her free hand, twirled her once, let my fingers slide from palm to tips, and walked into the Oakland night, friends forgotten, mile high. These next 2 poems take place in the same location about 20 years apart, and it's since been through several other changes in ownership. This one's called Pencil. At Major Pond's traveling Chautauqua on California to Divisadero, we met for drinks. Our faces changed in the 2 years gone. Yours sinuous, calculating, and mine like a balloon skin with a pin pressed against it. "I'm up for a fling," you said. "A fling?" "Yes, a fling. I could see it penciled in your leather calendar. Fling with Marc." As if I had no choice in the matter. And this one, same location 20 years later. It's called Solstice. I watched back 20 years tonight, sitting on a suede bar stool at Solstice, drinking soda water in the place, once Major Pond's traveling Chautauqua, full of funky Victorian couches and pitted floorboards, where double whiskeys flew down my throat, poured sloppy and delivered free by the waitress who called my name, and me too blind to see. I watched back 20 years as I stared past the too fine and too slick decor, the ethereal quasi-musicians playing their astral grind to when the Major's was a blues joint, with a whorehouse upright piano, and same said waitress used to let me tonk up the place on weeknights when the band was off. I watched back 20 years as I looked at the well-dressed folk sitting in the candlelit booths, restless jazz hopping and bopping, and before that, just the dusty sounds of creaky night music at the Major's. I watched back 20 years, drinking soda water, thinking, how do I gentle this old body I rode so hard? Can I freshen that up, said the chunky young man behind the over-polished bar. Huh? Can I put some soda water on top of that ice and lime you've got there? No thanks. I washed back 20 years chewing ice, missing the rough, scuffed bar, its pits and its dents, the scuffed and broken tables, random thrift store chairs, torn red couch velvet, and my sweet black-topped waitress who emptied the owner's pockets into my glass, standing me to round after round on those, for her, empty nights. I washed back 20 years, slid from my stool, swept round the joint the long way as I made for its still-bowed door, and smiled, knowing that we had changed places, Solstice and I. She was clean and bright and slick and new, and I'd become the trusty old rough and scuffed place of my youth, carrying now with me what I once needed place to establish. I'll read one more poem before we show some films, and then maybe one or two at the end. This one's called North Beach. It's a double sonnet. I described it as a double sonnet with a flavor shot because I learned how to write at Cafe Trieste and Cafe Puccini and Cafe Malvina, and it was Suvio and its specs and the spots around North Beach. where the writers wrote and musicians gathered and artists met each other. So this is called North Beach. Tonight I'm a mourner for when the Keystone Corner was on Vallejo, where I heard Art Blakey play and Denny Zeitlin say, I'm going to do a little number with Charlie Hayden on the bass. Tonight I turn and remember the Spaghetti Factory one December, flamenco dancers stomping in the back, ruffled dresses, black heels going clack against the faded floor, memory of Paramore, fading in the mist of the one I kissed, at the Savoy Tivoli, now only reverie, lost in a Grant Street bustle, a schlock shop hustle, across from the postcard store, selling remembrances of Evermore, in the land where jackalopes play, giant bunnies hop away, Edgerton's bullets stop, they say, as I try to grapple with what was that's actual, and what's at best, blue smoke curling at the old Trieste. So those are a few San Francisco poems, and now we'll show some films. I'll just say a word about each of them before we show them. And these will be shown in sequence. They've got soundtracks and voiceover, so I won't be reading with them. The first, Manicotti, is one of a series of films made from a collection of poems called Swizzlefeld's First Folio from the Typewriter Underground that conjures a fictive world of typists who dropped out from internet society and communicate via plain type. This particular film was directed by Ellen Hempel and Jim Haverkamp of Archipelago Cine and the theater and film faculty at Duke University. And it's a send-up of the 1980s downtown New York art scene. The next, Broken Lines, is directed by Oakland-based visual poetry filmmaker Jen V. And she brings here to life a poem of the same name from my 2015 collection, The Underwater Typewriter. And it's a beautiful consideration of how quickly we travel the interval between youth and old age. The third film, Price, is my second collaboration with animated filmmaker Jim Hall. For most of his career, Jim was an accomplished television photojournalist, winning 2 Peabody Awards and I believe 23 Emmys. When he retired, he turned to making poetry films in his unique style of animation, and also documentaries about notable musicians. He's currently completing a film about jazz giant Wes Montgomery. Price is now on the film festival circuit and was recently a finalist in animation at the Hollywood International Poetry Film Festival. So we'll see those 3 films now.